Hello and welcome to this session of Coffee with the Curator. And today we're going to be looking at Georgian Era Portraits from the collection. My name is Debra Antoncic and I'm the Director Curator at Riverbrink. I want to begin by acknowledging that we are meeting on lands that have been inhabited by Indigenous people for millennia, and we honor the centuries of Indigenous people who have walked on Turtle Island before us. We are grateful for the opportunity to live and work and play in Niagara, and we give thanks to the ancestors who have acted as stewards of this special place. So we're looking today at a series of portraits from the collection, all dating to the period known as the Georgian Era. This is named after the Hanoverian kings George I, the second, third, and fourth, and it dates from 1714 to approximately 1837, so around just over 100 years. Several of the artists are British born, but not all of them. And there is considerable stylistic variation in the exhibition, which is now installed on the second floor at Riverbrink. The unifying element, however, is the expression of class and position within political and governing settler elites in British North America following the Conquest. And the exhibition, this exhibition is intended to complement our featured exhibition for the summer, an installation, a contemporary exhibition, an installation by the artist Elizabeth Chitty titled Power. Riverbrink has quite an extensive collection of portraits. It seems to have been a genre that Sam Weir was interested in, and he was in fact part of a group earlier in the 20th century who attempted to start up a national portrait gallery without success. That idea has resurfaced several times, particularly in Ottawa, and again most recently, although to date I'm not sure how solid the plans are. But a national portrait gallery for Canada has been under discussion for over 100 years. We're looking here at the portrait head of General James Wolfe, in oil on canvas. And here I have to say that portraits of Wolfe, there are a number of portraits of Wolfe in our collection. In fact, this particular individual, probably more portraits of Wolfe than any other single figure. I've included him here at the start of this exhibition to signify the victory on the Plains of Abraham in 1759, when Wolfe was killed at the battle on the Plains of Abraham. And at the conclusion of the 7 Years' War, King George III claimed the territory of North America for Great Britain. So we have, as I said, many portraits of Wolfe, many depictions. Not all of them are portraits. The copies of the famous Death of Wolfe by the artist Benjamin West in an engraving, in a watercolor, and other artistic iterations of the idea of the death of Wolfe, this idea of the British general martyred on the Plains of Abraham in 1759. Wolfe was just 32 years old, and he's been described as the first modern hero, celebrated in books, in paintings, in prints and music, in poetry and prose, in the decorative arts, in theater, and in political oratory. So this perhaps helps to account for the number of depictions of Wolfe that we have in our collection. But it might be just coincidence, so we don't actually know. Certainly after 1805, Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson, killed at the Battle of Trafalgar, overtook Wolfe in the popular imagination. But the precedence for the mass marketing of a heroic figure within images of martyrdom to empire was by then well established. So as I said, we have both portraits and death scenes of Wolfe. Another portrait, this of an unknown young boy by William Burzy, a charcoal on paper. The terms of the 1763 Royal Proclamation issued on behalf of George III were ratified at a Congress of Indigenous leaders held at Fort Niagara in the summer of 1764. The renewal of peace and friendship and the resumption of trade with Indigenous peoples made possible by the accord resulted in accelerated settlement in a rush to govern the former French colonies. So I'm using this particular portrait to reference William Burzy, the artist's role in bringing colonists, settlers, to British North America following the accord with Indigenous leaders. William Burzy spent his youth in Vienna and studied in Italy and worked in England before leading a group of colonists to New York State in 1792 and in 1794 to present-day Markham in Upper Canada. Burzy was a popular early Canadian portraitist, and he also produced church decoration and architectural designs. But this lovely portrait, we get a sense of the dress and style of portraiture of a well-to-do family that could commission a portrait of this young boy at the time. And here I'm showing you just an installation view of our second floor. The collection of portraits amassed by Sam Weir, as I mentioned, is quite extensive. However, the organizing principle, the collecting principle, would appear to be the great man in history. There are very few portraits of women. The great man would have been a very common way of, very popular and long-standing way of studying history up until the 1970s. The idea of history from the top down, as opposed to the more recent turn to social history. But the great man in history tends to dominate our portraiture. So I'm including this portrait of Francis Davis by the artist Francis Coates, an oil on canvas, to bring into focus the absence of acknowledgement of the contributions of women. So this portrait dates to 1760. Francis Coates was an English painter, one of the pioneers of the English pastel painting, although this is an oil. And Coates was a founding member of the British Royal Academy in 1768. The artist was born in London, the son of an apothecary, and he trained with portrait painter George Knapton before setting up his own business. His exposure to his father's livelihood, that of an apothecary, was helpful to his study into the making of pastels, and he became one of the pioneers of pastel portraiture in Britain. He was popular and he was prolific. He was the fashionable choice for a portrait done in pastel. Frances Davis, I don't really have any information about her. This very attractive young woman, clearly from a well-to-do background, given the clothing, the dress, the hairstyle, and so on, and even indeed the very fact of a portrait being commissioned. She sits looking out at the viewer, her face resting on her palm, and she's leaning on the arm of a green-colored chair or sofa. The background is dark, which frames the pink of her dress and her pale skin. The lace cuffs are laid out as if to emphasize the richness of the dress and draw our attention to the artist's skill in capturing these details. And speaking of the great man in history, here we turn to the portrait of the young John Graves Simcoe, dating to 1770-75, by the artist William Pars. It was commissioned by Simcoe's mother, Catherine Stamford, prior to his departure for service in the American Revolutionary War. You can see on the left of the portrait a monument which was dedicated to his father, a funerary marker and an urn dedicated to Captain John Simcoe. And there is a ship on the right in the background identified as the HMS Pembroke. This was the British warship commanded by the senior Simcoe, who died en route to Quebec with James Wolfe. So today, the young Simcoe, John Graves Simcoe, is acknowledged for his role in the eventual abolition of slavery in British North America. The 1793 Act to limit slavery in Upper Canada is considered Simcoe's most important achievement, with implications for freedom seekers to Niagara. The artist William Pars was an English watercolor portrait and landscape painter, draftsman, and illustrator. And another quick view of the installation in the upstairs gallery. And moving on to another of the great men, portraits of great men in our collection. This a copy by the artist Philippa Abrams of the portrait of General Sir Isaac Brock, done by Gerritt Schipper, attributed to Gerritt Schipper. In the 200 years, most of the likenesses, since his death, most of the likenesses of Brock have emphasized the heroism of the dashing military leader, a romantic and inspirational figure within Canada's Anglo-British history, often shown at the Battle of Queenston Heights, the fallen hero, and so on. But the portrait of Brock that's attributed to Gerritt Schipper is quite different. It was done in Quebec in 1807 while Brock was stationed in Quebec as the colonial administrator there. The portrait remained with Brock until his death in 1812. The itinerant painter would have appeared to have been a very appropriate portraitist for a busy colonial administrator such as Brock, because he advertised his speed at capturing a likeness and offered a money-back guarantee if you weren't happy with the portrait. Schipper employed what he described as an achromatic camera obscura, a device used to project an image onto another surface where it can be copied or traced. The Amsterdam-born artist trained in Brussels and Paris before emigrating to North America, and he carried his drawing materials with him, likely preparing his own pastel crayons as he moved from place to place, making his living as an artist. Other portraits of great men from this era, Jean-Antoine Houdon, portrait bust of George Washington, dated to after 1785. An important figure in the American Revolutionary War with Britain and later the first president of the new republic, Jean-Antoine Houdon was invited to take a portrait of Washington. He was invited to the United States by Benjamin Franklin, the noted first president, also notorious for significant slave holdings. At Mount Vernon, Washington's plantation home, the former president sat for wet clay life models and a plaster life mask. These served as the basis for many commissions, including a standing figure and numerous variations. This version is in the classical manner, showing the musculature of a bare chest. Other variations include Washington as a general in uniform and as a Roman consul. Houdon's bust of Washington was very popular and helped to establish the iconography of the first president of the United States. Houdon was born in Versailles in 1741. The sculptor is famous and very well known for his portrait busts and statues of philosophers and inventors and political figures of the French Enlightenment. And turning to another portrait by William Burzy, this a portrait of Robert Prescott, dated to 1798 to 1799. Prescott was a British soldier and a colonial administrator. He enlisted in the British military in 1745 and served during the 7 Years' War. Prescott was at the siege of Louisbourg and became an aide-de-camp to General Jeffrey Amherst in 1759. Prescott participated in the capture of Montreal, and during the American Revolutionary War, Prescott saw action in New York and in Philadelphia. He was made the civil governor of Martinique in 1794, and in 1796 he was made lieutenant governor of Lower Canada, later governor-in-chief of British North America, and commander of British forces in the Canadas. So you can see from this extensive career the role of a colonial administrator moving from place to place in theater of war throughout North America. Prescott remained in the position until 1807, but spent much of his time in Britain. The portrait by Burzy was completed not long before Prescott was recalled in 1799. A physically diminutive man, General Prescott was considered a fair colonial administrator during a period of conflict in Lower Canada, that is, between the French and the English. But he was also had a reputation for being impatient and quick to judgment. And I think those qualities come through in this very small and detailed portrait that I hope everyone will have the opportunity to come in and see in person, because he does, the artist seems to have captured that combative aspect of his personality in this small portrait. And moving on to this portrait of John Kerr, again, a relatively unknown sitter. I don't have any information about Kerr. The important point here being the portrait is done by George Romney, and it dates to 1778. So Romney was an English portrait painter, one of the most fashionable artists of his day. He apprenticed in Kendal in Northern England and set up his own portrait practice before moving to London in 1762. This portrait was completed during his most prolific and successful period. Romney developed a circle of important and well-connected clients and admirers and enjoyed a highly successful career as a portraitist. But despite being celebrated for his portraits, however, Romney was dissatisfied, and his ambition was to achieve fame in the domain of historical and allegorical painting. In the hierarchy of genres, portraiture would have been found near to the end, despite his popularity. The height of ambition was at the top of the hierarchy for history, mythological and religious scenes. And this is what Romney apparently aspired to. For me, I think of this portrait as emblematic of the wealth and prosperity that Britain was enjoying in the second half of the 18th century, wealth that was based on the expansion of empire, the East India Company creating great wealth for shareholders and East India Company officials. Also, the wealth generated by the transatlantic trade, indeed in slavery. And now we have a situation where not only the aristocracy, but general wealthy individuals of the merchant class and the middle classes are now successful and wealthy enough to afford portraits. And this lovely portrait with his coat is just slightly undone at the waist, a bit of extra girth around the middle, apparently, for comfortable seating, just I think suggests this moment of wealth that is built on the expansion of empire. And here, just another quick view of the upstairs installation. And ending with this quite extraordinary engraving, mezzotint by John Raphael Smith, after George Romney's portrait of Joseph Tagodiniga, called Brandt, the Great Captain of Six Nations, completed after 1776. Kayindinegeya wears a fanciful style of dress that is neither Anglo-American nor American Indian, but rather an invention reflecting intercultural exchange. The silver gorget at his neck is a remnant of medieval armor, and it was presented to him by King George III. It declares his English associations. This was a ceremonial neckpiece that British officers would have worn as a reminder of the tradition of medieval armor. The leggings he wears, in contrast, are authentically indigenous. They've been identified by research at the Smithsonian. And the rest of his clothing and accessories were manufactured in Britain in imitation of native Indian designs, elements in a conventional mode of attire adopted by Native Americans who were engaged in diplomacy and trade and known in the 18th century as, quote, Indian dress. Although Brandt wore Anglo clothing in his daily life, he adopted some version of Indian dress in all of his portraits, which he described on one occasion as more in keeping with his dignity. The engraving was done after this portrait of Joseph Brandt by George Romney, which is in the collection of the National Gallery of Canada. It was commissioned by the Earl of Warwick when Brandt visited England in 1775. Brandt was courted by both sides in the lead up to the American Revolutionary War, and following his visit to the UK, the Mohawk leader decided that alliance with the American colonists would mean disaster for Native Americans. He persuaded the Iroquois Confederacy to side with the British. The mezzotint was published just 3 months after a decisive victory at Cherry Hill, New York, in 1778, in which Brandt played a decisive role. So the engraving was perhaps intended to capitalize on rekindled British fascination with Brandt following this victory. Ultimately, of course, they lost the war. Brandt returned to London in November of 1775 following the conclusion of the war and was granted a pension. The British government agreed to compensate the Mohawk for the losses incurred through their loyalty to the British and purchased the Haldimand Tract for the Haudenosaunee Six Nations from the Mississaugas. The portrait seems highly influenced by European expectations. We don't really know exactly what Brandt looked like. There are no photographs for a comparison, but the artist does seem to have emphasized European appearance. The selection of portraits that I've included in this small exhibition certainly lack diversity, and it gives us an incomplete idea of the past. But the likenesses, the personalities captured by the artists are quite interesting. And I think it very nicely complements the, as I said, the exhibition Power, which will be installed on the main floor and opening soon. Thank you for joining me, and I look forward to welcoming you to Riverbrink in person before too long. Thank you.